Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Students. I'm going to introduce them, and perhaps you can applaud for them at the end of the introductions. We have Mateo Bevington of Lincoln High School, Audrey Kittams of Lake Oswego High School, Darcy Vile of Newburgh High School, and Ingmarie Putka from Grant High School. Now, questions were submitted in advance of the meeting in writing by members of the Portland and Newburgh City Clubs, members of the League of Women Voters, and high school students from all over the state. Committees from the co-sponsoring organizations selected the questions. These are the only questions which will be asked today. There will be no questions from the floor. The candidates have not, of course, seen these questions in advance. Each candidate will have 90 seconds to respond to the question, and then following each answer, the opposing candidate will have the option of a 60-second rebuttal. Our timer, seated in front today, is Debbie Iona. Debbie is with the League of Women Voters. Following the panel questions, each candidate will then have an opportunity to ask 2 cross questions of the other. Following the rotation of candidate questions, each candidate will then make a 3-minute closing statement. The meeting is, of course, governed by the program format I've just described and by the rules of conduct which are displayed on all of your tables. Please hold your applause until the end of the debate. I'm sure our good manners will prevent any hissing or booing. Let me briefly introduce our participants. Stan Bunn is a native of Oregon. He has degrees in economics and law from Willamette University. He served 12 years in the Oregon House and 4 years in the Oregon Senate. Margaret Carter was born in Shreveport, Louisiana, but moved to Oregon 30 years ago. She has a degree in elementary education from Portland State and a master's degree in education psychology from Oregon State. She served 14 years in the Oregon House. Both of the candidates have been leaders in education-related issues in both the Oregon Legislature and elsewhere. I'd now like the candidates to approach their podiums. And Margaret, I think by the choice of the straws, you are the first opener.
Good afternoon. Mr. President, members, family, and friends. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you today. What I hope to make clear to you this afternoon is that I have a passion for education. This is the reason I'm running for state school superintendent. I am truly excited about kids, about education, and I have been all of my life. I am not a Janetta come lately. I am not running because I need a job. I don't need one. I am not interested in using this job of school superintendent as a stepping stone to other elected office. I don't want to be Secretary of State. I don't want to be governor, and I most definitely don't want to go to Congress. What I want, however, is to be the voice for public education in this state, my state of Oregon. Let me tell you a little bit about my background. First and foremost, I am the educator in this race. I have been a music teacher, a reading teacher, and for the last 25 years, a faculty member and counselor at Portland Community College. For the past 14 years, I have represented Northeast Portland in the Oregon House. As a state representative, I have served on all the major committees dealing with education. I pushed for an expansion of Head Start, and I was chief sponsor for the Workforce 2000 Act to create skill centers throughout this state. And I have always been a strong supporter of better funding for schools. Now let me tell you briefly what my top priorities as state school superintendent will be. Number one, rebuilding the public's trust in our schools. A trust that has been so badly eroded, it has cost us public support. Number two, encouraging excellence in our schools through the dissemination of best practices. And number 3, addressing the long-term financial stability of public education in this state. I have visited schools all over this state. I have seen firsthand, ladies and gentlemen, small and large miracles that are happening in our schools, even in the face of inadequate resources. At Washington Elementary School in Medford, a school with an extremely high percentage of diverse children below the poverty line, students are achieving some of the highest reading scores in the state. The secret, an extraordinary program of parental involvement. At the Dallas High School, students are working in an exciting partnership with local hospitals. This race is about leadership. I want to lead the State Department of Education to be a resource to help school districts implement school reform so teachers can teach and kids can learn. I have been described as a cheerleader and a champion for public schools, and frankly, I am both a cheerleader and a champion. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
I'm very glad to be here today. You know, when we started, Peter asked the question, have you run for a lot of offices, or are there just a lot of buns? I want to tell you, I have 10 brothers and sisters, and you know, we all have 2 buns, so I have to say that if you want to remember this, Jim Bunn's the bun on the right and Stan Bunn's the bun on the left. I'm truly delighted to be here. I want to suggest to you a thought as we begin this discussion, and that is that the only office in the state of Oregon that is dedicated solely to assuring that our children have the best possible education in this country is the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And with that being true, it is absolutely essential that the superintendent and any candidate for that office have a strong history of leadership and a very clear and precise vision for education in this state. And I want to share what I think are some important parts of my vision for education. First is access. Every student in this state must have an equal opportunity to begin school, and we have to do that through aggressively and continually working for early childhood intervention and Head Start programs that assure each child has that opportunity. Second, we must have tremendously high standards, and we should continue and finish the work of education reform with higher standards in math, science, and reading skills. And then third, it's critical that children in this state be engaged in their education, enjoy it, love learning, and follow through for the rest of their life. I suggest to you that we cannot do that unless we recruit the brightest and the best in our society as teachers and find ways to maintain them as the mentors for our children. And then as we're developing those high standards for math and science, we can't forget sports, the arts, student leadership that have provided character development for the kids in this state and have assured that many children that would not otherwise stay in school stayed in school. We've got to reverse the trend of higher class sizes, starting first with the lower elementary grade levels to reduce class size, and we have to work until we get that done. And we need to fund education first in the state budget so that the budget question is not how much money is left, but how much money is needed. And we must find a long-term, stable source of funding. Over the next hour, I look forward to discussing those issues with you, and over the next month, as we come to the conclusion of the campaign, I look forward to discussing them with you further. Thank you.
Now we've had nice quiet applause for both of their opening statements. Let's hold the applause till the end from now on. Now we're going to move to the questions from the panelists. Again, the answers will be 90 seconds, followed by a 60-second rebuttal. The first question will come from Mateo Bevington of Margaret Carter.
Thank you. Some school districts have serious funding gaps, while others do not. Should these school districts be allowed to impose local taxes to eliminate the gaps?
One of the things that we did this last session was to provide opportunity for people to seek funding through the initiative process. And I think that that's a way to go, because otherwise we will get the whole issue of equity confused. And when we do that, money that goes into, we will still create another imbalance for our schools. So I think it's important that people at local levels determine the additional funds that they're going to use for their schools.
I do believe in the local option. As Margaret mentioned, we work very, very hard on equalization. We're one of the few states in the nation that has truly come to close to equalization. But we do need a local option with a limit that says local school districts can enrich their program. We have to set by agreement throughout the state a limit that isn't gone beyond, so that equalization is still meaningful but allows enrichment in each school district.
Auditor, your question is of Mr. Bunn.
Right. The passage of Measure 5 and the move to equalization have left some school districts struggling. The districts have asked for additional funding, but the legislature's view seems to be that the solution isn't more money, but improved efficiency. How would you address both points of view and ensure that adequate resources reach the students?
Immediately after ballot measure 5 passed, I chaired the Education Subcommittee of Ways and Means, and we struggled not only with how we fund K through 12 at the state level as we shifted, but how we tried to keep community colleges and higher education whole. And I want to remind you that we have to protect those areas while we're fighting for K through 12 also. I believe that we do need a clear plan for long-term stable funding of education. We need to use the surpluses that are in the budget for the next biennium primarily for education, and we need to assure that we have a long-term stable plan. The income tax works good during economic good times. It works very poorly for education during recessions. We must have a significant rainy day fund that's funded during the good times to assure that during the down times education is kept whole, and I will fight aggressively for that.
First of all, this is not about a plan. This is about kids. We have had plans that date back to as far as Governor McCall. The uniqueness of all of this, that all of the governors since Governor McCall have had a plan. This is not about a plan, because if we're talking about a plan, the voters have rejected those plans. You want to know why they rejected them? Because of a lack of trust in our public school system. My first priority will be to restore that public trust and to look at long-term funding, not before the voters, because I think anyone going out before the voters missed the mark. We must sit down together and see how we're going to go forth with funding in the state. Otherwise, we're going to have that imbalance again, and we're not going to have the kind of efficiency in the system that we need to have. But we do need to make very sure that programs are not shortcut as it relates to our kids, because excellence is going to be the mark of the future. And it's very important that we make sure that funding is one of those things that we look at in terms of not only efficiency, but in terms of parental involvement.
Darcy, your question is Ms. Carter.
How would you define a quality education, and how would you ensure that all Oregon students receive one?
I believe that we're going on the right path with reform, because we have standards in place, and with those standards being in place, they will allow us much more quickly to look at what is happening to our students. When we look at that whole issue of testing, when a kid is in 3rd grade, we start assessing where they are. We have a better opportunity to be able to measure their successes and how they are improving, which is the big issue of the day for us here in Oregon if we're going to continue the support of the public. So we must be able to do assessment, and one of the ideas I have is to make sure that we have assessment centers so that young people can feel as if they can go to take the test when they get ready. So I think that is one of the ways, and I think the Superintendent of Public Instruction can use this bully pulpit to encourage young people to stay in school, because the dropout rate in Oregon is much too high.
A quality education is one that equips students for a lifetime of learning, that allows them to adapt to change, that allows them to have a broad-based understanding of the world and the parts of the world. We are moving to do that with education reform. We've had some bumps in the road, but we can aggressively continue the adaptability of our education process and the excellent standards of math, science, and reading. We recently had testing of middle-aged school children that showed that we were second only to Singapore in the world in terms of their capability. We need to make it clear that that success is occurring today and that we can make it even better tomorrow.
Thank you. What would you do to increase funding for public schools, especially now during strong economic times in Oregon?
I suggested a plan that says we should now, in the 1999 legislature, adopt a large rainy day fund that had 4 sources of funding, and that the money be placed in that fund, that there be a provision in the law that as cutbacks occur in downturns, education initially could not be cut more than other programs, and then the rainy day fund would be put in to make it whole again. And that it could be used only for this purpose, and only the earnings from the fund could be used. The sales tax has failed in Oregon. The property tax has been removed as a source. The income tax is the source we have, and it's essential that we make it a workable and usable plan, both in good times and bad times.
I think it would be not to our advantage to go out before the voters are ready for a sales tax, income tax, or any kind of increase in funding in this state. It is true that we need to continue to work on the issue of long-term funding, which is definitely what I have done through all of my years in the legislature and through my adult life as an educator. But if we're going to repeat the mistakes of the past and go out with an income tax increase or to reproduce the sales tax again, we're going to only fail at it, because the voters are calling for accountability in the system. And until we can restore that public trust, we are not going to be able to get long-term funding in this state. We're going to repeat the errings of our past, and that is the voters will vote it down again until they're ready for it. So I think what we have to do is to bring all of the vested interests together, bring Republicans and Democrats, bring labor and management, bring parents and teachers together to talk about long-term funding in this state. But I think it would be a mistake for any leader to go out before the electorate in this state to propose long-term funding without their support.
Another question of Ms. Carter.
Given the legislature's role in funding education in Oregon, how do you feel about statewide teacher contracts negotiated at the state level?
I think when we look at statewide teacher negotiations or statewide salaries, we take away from the locally elected school boards. The locally elected school boards are in the trenches, on the job, on a more day-to-day basis, and quite frankly, when you look at the negotiations that have been going on in the state with Oregon public employees, to think that we want to be able to put another agency in place in Oregon, I don't know about you, but it makes me a little nervous for us to even want to do that. And so I'm very much in favor of local control and locally elected school board members continuing to be in charge of those issues.
Except for, excuse me, except for tours, you don't teach children at the state capitol in Salem or at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They're taught in local schools. And it is essential that we keep local wage setting and local negotiation. We have different regions of the state. Some are more geographically appealing than others. A particular school district may need to pay a math teacher more, or may need to pay a superintendent more to draw the best and the brightest to their area. We need to have that capability, and we need to have more than advisors at the local school board level. We need to have people who are empowered to make the decision on how children are educated in the particular community that they're involved in.
Mr. Bunn?
What policy should be implemented to educate the faculty and students to prevent harassment of gay, lesbian, and bisexual students?
We need to have an aggressive policy that makes it clear that we have absolutely no tolerance for harassment whatsoever, and that there are clear guidelines at the state level and in each school district, and that they're implemented, and that there is an understanding about diversity through the system at the local school district, so that we don't come up to facing those kinds of issues.
Part of the model of teaching excellence in our school has everything to do with teaching respect and honoring cultural diversity honoring whatever level of diversity, whether it's socioeconomic or it's homosexuality or homosexuals and gay and lesbians in the class. We're talking about human beings. And I think it is imperative for us in our model of excellence to teach dignity and respect to each of our young people so that no one in this state will ever feel as if because of whom they are being harassed. I just think we cannot tolerate that.
In light of recent events involving children and teens with guns and bombs, what strategies do you support to prevent similar tragedies?
I think it is very important for us to allow local districts to determine what level of involvement they're going to have with the whole issue of nonviolence or being able to keep guns out of school. We must have a policy that says absolutely, positively, no tolerance for weapons in our schools. And so I think local districts should make that determination in terms of that. But I think a policy statement should come from the state in terms of us not tolerating any guns in our schools as a leadership issue.
We need first absolute zero tolerance for weapons or threat of weapons in any school in the state of Oregon. Second, we need the State Department of Education to do a far better job through their website and other communications of giving to all school districts the best information on the best plans that are available for safety. Third, we need to send teams into our grade schools, our elementary schools, to help students at that level take ownership in safety so that by the time they get to the middle school and high school level, it's appropriate and it's a cultural acceptable process to be able to communicate with adults in that situation, with those students knowing more about what goes on with their fellow students than anything else. And finally, recognizing that we have to work in the short term and the long term. If we want to do probably the most we can do about school safety, about dropout rates, about learning and speed of learning, we will go back to what I said earlier and aggressively work with Head Start programs.
Thank you. What are some specific actions for which you are willing to be held accountable so that we may judge your performance?
Well, the first thing is there's a distinct difference between Margaret and I on the style of leadership. You know, a few years ago, people were saying to us that in terms of health care, you can't bring forward a health care plan. We've had health care plan 1, we've had health care plan 2, health care plan 3. But John Kitzhaber believed you can't form a vision and leadership without a plan, and he developed the Oregon Health Plan. You cannot develop leadership and a vision for education in this state without concrete plans. John Kitzhaber and I talked earlier this week about the Oregon Challenge and how we could plug modules of finance reform into that from the effort I'm making. I'll be held accountable for standing out front and saying we must have funds for education, we must have those first, and we must fund adequately, and we must stay at it until we get it right.
I think we must have a repository of best practices in place so that when schools in this state are having problems or having challenges with our young people in our schools, we can look across the state to see where some of those best practices are. And one example would be a kid that I went to school in Medford. A young man was having problems in Medford. And he was having problems because he was one of very few minority students in the school. That school sent him to Portland to be involved in classes where he could learn to deal with his whole issue of being African American in a school where there were so many whites, and learning how to have the kind of behavior that holds not only others responsible but himself responsible. I think that is very important. So that would be an idea toward best practices. We have a teacher down in Baker City who was doing some work with a high school student in terms of science as it relates to the fisheries. And they're going to, as a matter of fact, next spring they invited me to come back to do some cooking with them in terms of the fish that they are using in that particular area. So those kind of best practices being in place in Oregon.
Question of Ms. Carter.
Why are you a better choice for this position than your opponent?
Well, I think Mr. Bunn just said it, and that is that because of our difference in terms of leadership style and our difference in terms of our vision and how we view the future. I'm a very positive voice for education, and I am an educator, first and foremost. I have 9 children. I have 24 grandkids who are in school, so my personal and professional life has been one where it's been in touch with education, and I'm one of the people who brought skill centers to this state because I knew that we had double-digit unemployment in this state and we need to do something about it. And so I feel that I'm not only a positive voice, but I'm a go-getter who's willing to get the job done and work until it's done.
Margaret and I have both been educators for years. We have both worked on education issues, but I want to suggest to you that what is needed at this time, this juncture in our history, where we're going to decide over the next 5 years whether our public schools are the center of activity or whether we're going to siphon off resources for private schools and not meet our goals in the public schools, is a leader who will be out front, who will take and make tough choices, who will use a collaborative style to work with the public, with the Oregon Education Association, school boards, every group, the governor and the legislature, but using this office as a bully pulpit where constantly there is a recognition of our quality, but the realization that we can do better, fight for more, and in the end accomplish more.
Question, Mr. Bunn.
The Oregon Legislature has grappled with the issue of charter schools for at least 2 sessions, but so far has not achieved agreement on how or whether to permit them. Under what circumstances would you support constituting charter schools in Oregon?
There are about 25 different definitions of charter schools and probably 15 different kinds of charter schools. I support very strongly charter schools within the public education system. You must have a process by where there is community accountability. You don't want a snake oil salesman coming in and setting up a charter school in a local community with no local accountability and no way to monitor or control. So if the local school board has a sign-off process and an involvement process, and it is, if we're using public funds, a public facility, then that is an excellent process. We've done charter schools without that name for years. Students from Dayton could go to Newburgh and take creative programs through ESD cooperation. We simply need to aggressively build on that system, keep it within the public forum, use the innovative processes that are available there, but I plead for the process that does not siphon off public funds and take those away to the private sector.
Charter schools are really a very creative way for districts to be involved with holding on to their students, but also to create particular kind of coursework for those students. I'm reminded of a school in Bunn that I went to visit. The young people there, it's a school that's basically connected away from the high school, but the ideals are the same in terms of excellence, in terms of reform, in terms of the standards that are necessary. And so I think as long as we have the standards in place, we have the creativity, and we have the excellence in place for charter schools to continue to be alive and well as we do in this state. We have a wonderful charter school in Salem, with one in Scappoose, and certainly the one that is in Bend, and they're doing good jobs, and I think young people are very, very involved. The last one was in Baker City, where the school is within the school itself, and I think it's quite smart because the principal also get a chance to keep his FTEs right on campus.
Question of Ms. Carter.
The 1998-1999 school year is the first test of students' ability to achieve certain certificates of initial mastery standards. Many educators and parents are worried that a significant number of students will be unable to meet these new requirements. What should be done about this?
First of all, I think that what we need to do is to dispel many of the myths about reform and what it's designed to do. And I think if we get in our heads, ladies and gentlemen, that reform is a goal, that it's all about making sure that our young people have the opportunity to have a quality education for the future. And it's very important that we understand that there's always a 2-year difference, whether you're 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, or 10th grade, by which if you miss the assessment piece and don't pass at the level in which you should pass at in order to meet the standards, we have 2 years by which we can bring you up to standard. But if we would not have goals in place for our students to have a quality education, I think we would be missing the mark in terms of that. So I believe very strongly that I have a lot of hope in our teachers and our institutions that those 2 years between 10th and 12th grade, that our young people will make up those standards and be able to pass the certificate of initial mastery.
In a tremendously successful program, this is one of the areas I think we have danger of failure. If we continue as we are today, I think in a couple of years we'll have 50–60% of the students with the word failure stamped on their forehead. I think we have to reverse that. We have a tremendously beneficial program, and we have not yet addressed the issue of how all students become successes in that process. We have unfortunately in education reform used legalese. We've failed to use the simple language of the 3 R's, if you will. So I want to give you a simple parallel of success that we should look at a little more closely. The scouting program in the United States for years has had Eagle Scout. It has had merit badges. It has had portfolios that develop toward merit badges. And you know, when you were an Eagle Scout, when you met one of the tests, you were a tremendous success. But there was never a scout that had not yet met that test who was considered a failure. Now that's a simple thought, but it's a critically important thought. We need to translate that to education reform.
Question, Mr. Bunn.
What are the pros and cons for electing the superintendent of public instruction?
You know, I guess the downside would be if you got a nut elected. And actually, there was some discussion about a concern at one point that if the office did not have high enough visibility, you could get an extreme person on either side of the political spectrum. In reality, there's good news. We had 16 candidates for superintendent. Now, I personally believe that was about the right size for a classroom and not people running against me. But that having been said, we have tremendous interest. I earlier indicated it was the only office in the state where you could focus purely on education. You could be out front, not held back by other issues. We need an elected position that can be a strong bully pulpit for the advancement of education, and at times follow the governor, at times pull the governor and legislature along. And I believe the only way to assure that that's done is to have it a strong elective position. It is emerging as a stronger and stronger role that can do tremendous good in the state.
I think I'd like to start at the con piece of it. It reminds me of a three-legged stool. You have the governor with the constitutional responsibility for education, who proposes to this legislative assembly, who disposes of the budget of education. And then you have the statutorial responsibility for the state superintendent. Now, to me, something is wrong with that picture, because the superintendent doesn't really have to answer to either of these bodies, except in the sense that he or she will want to make sure the budget is passed. But in terms of the total responsibility, the governor is given that constitutional responsibility. And so I think that with that in mind, I would have been one of the people who would have supported an appointed position by the governor. Now, the pros of this office is that it is an office where the people speak. It's the voice of the people. And I think that is very important. The challenges that are in the system, the opportunities that are in the systems, to issue a report card of how well our students are doing, I think is also one of the pros of this position as well.
Now going to the part of the program where the candidates each get to ask 2 questions of each other. The question will be asked in no more than 30 seconds. The response will be no more than 60 seconds. And then the question asker gets a chance to rebut for 30 seconds. The first question will be asked by Ms. Carter.
Thank you. Mr. Bunn, you and I have been together at a lot of forums in the last few months, and we've been asked about tenure for school administrators and teachers. So it still isn't very clear to me what your position is, because frankly I heard you say something a little different to the school administrators in June than what I heard you say to the teachers in April.
Well, let me say first, and there's a clear record, I said exactly the same thing to the school administrators and to the school boards and to the teachers at any time I was asked. And I will continue to do that, and I'll say the same thing to you, and it is this. It is that in 1975, I stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and fought for a fair dismissal practice process. I did that because there was testimony about the tremendous arbitrariness that had occurred to that point in dismissal of really top-notch teachers. I have fought for that fair dismissal practice process from that day until now, and I continue to support it. I want to make it very clear that I don't support keeping bad teachers. I don't support tenure for bad teachers. I've worked with school board members, and I've worked with the OEA to suggest that we change the way that process is actually working within the law so that we can assure that we have just the best teachers, but I want to maintain the protection of a fair dismissal process.
The School Boards Association, the principals, and the business community of this state say it very clearly. We want accountability of all of you guys as educators, Margaret Carter, and we want it to be very clear that we think the only way we can do that is to have accountability in the system. And so therefore, Senate Bill 880 was the means by which, the first step by which we would look at accountability in the system. And Mr. Bunn, according to a sign that he had on himself, he said that he would have supported, he would not have supported that bill had he been in the legislature.
Margaret, in the Oregon Statesman Journal on September 18th, you were quoted in this article as saying, we had $40 billion in the state coffers right now available for education, so you didn't want to use any of the additional $250 million projected surplus on education. Can you explain further?
Yes. My comments was to the fact that we had $40 billion in the coffer, period, not for education, but in the state's budget. And that if we had the will to pay for education in the state, we could certainly do it. Mr. Bunn, your proposal for $250 million came from income tax, and I said I was not willing to put myself on the line to go before the business community and make those dollars available without support from the business community.
I'm glad we had a clarification of the $40 billion because we struggle with about a little bit over $2 billion a year for education in the state. We have on latest forecasts about $250 million of additional revenue, and I want to suggest to you that if we truly have a commitment to education as our #1 priority, the #1 question that should be asked about that $250 million is not, let's not spend it for education. How much do we need of that money, that additional surplus, to assure that we have the things we need for education?
In the Statesman Journal, Stan, both of us were asked about the issue of our commitment to this position. So many people I've talked to are concerned that this office is just being used as a stepping stone to higher office. So can you let us know how many times you've run for state, local, and federal office, and what are those offices, and is this just a stepping stone for you to another position?
No, I can't tell you how many times I've run for office. I ran for the House, and I was asked several times in the House, will you stay here and serve? And I served for 12 years. And I was asked when I went to the Senate if I would serve a full term, and I served a full term. I have made and am working with people from all over this state a 6-year plan for what the Department of Education needs to do over the next 6 years. It is the logical time period for work with the legislature and with the governor. I have no interest in a stepping stone. I've never had an interest in stepping stone, and I want to commit to you that what I'm interested in doing is partnering with you to assure that our children have the best education possible, and I'm confident we're going to be able to do that over the next 6 to 8 years.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Margaret, how would your administration differ from that of the current Superintendent of Public Instruction?
#1, I'd be a very positive voice for education and stop the bashing that I'm hearing in Oregon today about our teachers and about what bad condition our schools are in. When you look at how Oregon students have been performing on SAT tests, you will see that we lead the nation. We're among those who are leaders in the nation. When you look at how we've done in math and science internationally, again, referring to Singapore being the only country that beat us in that area. You look at some of the best practices around this state, it is hard to beat Oregon in terms of of the kind of best practices and the level of professionalism that we have in our teachers and in our schools today. So I think that it's important to know that one of the things I would be is a positive voice for education, but also create a repository of best practices in this state so people won't have to bring in so many high-priced consultants to get the job done when we are the leaders in reform in this country. And I think that all we have to do is look around us in this state and find those.
I appreciate having the endorsement of Norma Paulus, and I've worked very hard with her on education reform, but I want to suggest some significant differences between the way we work. The articles that Margaret and I mentioned in the Statesman Journal, the headline on the Stan Bunn article was, "Bunn Defends Teachers." And I did that because I wanted people in this state to know our teachers are the best in the nation. They truly are. And if we're going to keep the brightest and best teachers, the most important element in our educational system except our children, then we have to give them the message that we recognize with pride the contribution they're making.
We now move to the final portion of the debate, the 3-minute closing question. Again, the order was chosen by a drawing of straws, and Ms. Carter will be first.
What I want to do with these last few minutes, ladies and gentlemen, is to tell you a little about myself again, my personal background, and what is different about my candidacy. First, as I said before, I am the educator in this race. And the last time I checked, this is the Department of Education, not the Department of Lawyering. For as long as I can remember, I was always determined to be an educator. I began as a visiting music teacher in rural Louisiana, traveling from school to school in a beat-up old Chevy, but I must tell you, once I got inside the classroom, we made beautiful music together. Since moving to Oregon, I earned a bachelor's degree in elementary education at Portland State University and a master's degree at Oregon State. I taught in an alternative school in Northeast Portland, and for the last 25 years, I have been a counselor at Portland Community College, helping literally thousands of people, young and middle-aged and older, make important decisions about education and careers in this lifelong pursuit of education. I must say to you, there were some major challenges along the way for me. I raised a family of 9 children, mostly as a single mother. We were even briefly on welfare. I worked, I went to school, and I raised the children with education as a high priority for every one of us. We even competed in terms of test taking. We studied together. It was not always smooth sailing, I must say to you. But I'm proud to say that today my family is loving and close. And they are now almost all college graduates from Oregon School. But I must tell you, we have to still work on a couple of them. I have talked a lot about my enthusiasm for public education. I do believe very strongly it is time to stop bashing our schools and start talking about our successes. The public, I feel, would be much more willing to invest in an institution it believes is successful. This enthusiasm should not be confused with naivete either. I am well aware that we face major challenges. I truly believe that I have the energy and the positive leadership this job needs. I mentioned before about the 9 children. Well, these 9 children have now made me a grandmother 24 times over. And I must tell you, these 24 grandchildren are really what it's all about, their future in education. I am to do everything I can. If I am to do everything I can assure the best possible education for my grandchildren, which manifests itself in terms of all of Oregon's children. And that's what this job is all about. It is important. I am not normally a name dropper, but I must say to you, I too am endorsed by educators. I'm also endorsed by former candidates in this race, all educators. Mr. Ron Adams, Colin Carr Morris, these people are here with me today. Carol Simile Dixon, Jack Bray, American Federation of Teachers. These are teachers who practice excellence as well in this state, and the Confederation of Oregon School Administrations. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to have spent time with you today, though nervous, and willing to get the job done for you and have the energy for doing it.
I thank you for having us here today. I have to say right up front, I can't compete with having 9 children, and I'm not going to try. You have 2 candidates before you today. You have 2 people who have taught school, 2 people who have been in the legislature for 15 or 16 years, and I think 2 people who have a passion for education. So how do you make the decision? You know, in the primary we had 16 candidates. We had, in addition to Margaret and I, a school superintendent from Lane County, a principal from Portland, teacher from Salem, teachers from other areas, and a contractor. And at that time, the school boards, the superintendent's organization, principal's organization, the Oregon Education Association, 10 community newspapers had to and wanted to make a decision. And I'd like to read from you just briefly from what the Oregon Statesman Journal from Salem said about the race at that time as they endorsed my candidacy. Of all the candidates interviewed by the Statesman Journal editorial board, Bunn demonstrated the deepest understanding of the educational challenges facing the state. He has the common sense of a small-town Oregon lawyer. He has the political intuition of a 16-year veteran of the Oregon House and Senate, where he helped write the state's education budget and was one of the most widely respected legislators. He has the credibility of being a former chairman of the State Ethics Commission, and he has the passion for education that comes from being a parent, a former adjunct professor at George Fox University, and a former trustee of Willamette University. Bunn recognizes that effective education starts with Head Start and other early intervention programs. His top priority is to see that education is funded first in the state budget, for the legislature to look at what's needed for schools instead of what's left over after other programs. I asked for and received the support of those groups I mentioned to share in my vision for education and to work with them to make this a reality. I ask you to join in a commitment to education. I ask specifically for your endorsement. I seek it, I want it, and I want to partner with you so that we can truly make education the best possible education in the country. I thank you for having us here, and again, I ask for your support.
I want to thank both of our candidates. Let's give them both an applause. We're certainly very fortunate to have such qualified candidates running for this important office. Today I want to thank our co-sponsoring organizations and for our students for participating. Remember that in 1 week we'll have the debate between Tanya Collier and Dan Salzman, candidates for City Commissioner. Now remember to call in your reservation by 2 p.m. on Wednesday. These debates over the next few weeks will be filling up fast, so make sure to sign up. Thank you for coming today. Wonderful job. Wonderful job. Thank you. Good job. How are you?